The slap landed so loudly that the entire cafe went silent. Coffee cups freezing midair and conversations dying instantly. And as my head turned slightly from the impact, I tasted blood and heard my daughter gasp behind me. Because this was supposed to be a quiet afternoon. Just a tired single father sharing a sandwich with his little girl after a long week. Not the moment a loud, well-dressed man decided to remind the room who he thought mattered and who did not, sneering about my worn jacket, my daughter's second-hand shoes, and the way I dared to take up space at a table near the window. And when I calmly asked him to step back and lower his voice, he laughed, called me weak, and struck me again, not knowing that the stillness in my eyes was not fear, but discipline. The kind carved by years of training where reacting without thinking could get people killed. Because before I was a janitor with calloused hands and a quiet life before. I became a widowed father learning how to braid hair and pack lunches. I was Sergeant Michael Hayes, Delta Force, a man trained to survive chaos without becoming it. And as the bully raised his hand a third time, fueled by the approval he expected from the room, I gently took my daughter's hand, guided her behind me, and stood up slowly every movement. Deliberate control, because real strength never rushes. And when I spoke, it was not loud but steady, telling him this ended. Now, that he would apologize and walk away. The cafe manager trembling, customers reaching for phones, the man mistaking calm for weakness and shoving me hard, triggering muscle memory older than pain. And in one clean motion, I redirected his momentum, pinned him to the floor without striking him once. His face twisted in shock as he realized he could not move, not because of force, but because of precision. The room erupting into gasps as someone shouted to call the police. My daughter, watching with wide eyes, not of fear but of trust. And when officers arrived moments later, confusion hung thick until one recognized me, his posture straightening as he quietly said my name and rank. The bully's face draining of color as the truth settled in, that the man he had slapped for sport had spent his life protecting others, and his statements were taken and apologies stumbled out too late. I knelt in front of my daughter and told her that power is not proven by hurting people. It is proven by knowing when not to. And later that evening, as we walked home under a soft orange sky, my hand in hers, I understood something deeper than victory or revenge. That legends do not announce themselves. They retire quietly, raise their children, drink coffee in peace, and only reveal who they are when forced to choose between ego and restraint. And that day in a small cafe, surrounded by strangers, my daughter did not see her father fight. She saw him stand, and that is the legacy no bully can ever take away. What happened after the police left was quieter but heavier, because silence can weigh more than noise. And as the cafe slowly returned to life, people whispering and staring with a new kind of respect, I felt something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with adrenaline, because I had spent years making myself small on purpose, believing that blending in was the safest way to raise my daughter without dragging the past back into our lives. And now that past had brushed the surface again, not by my choice, but by someone else's cruelty. And as we sat back down to finish a meal that no longer tasted the same, a young man from another table approached us, hands shaking, and quietly said he was sorry for not stepping in sooner, admitting he froze when things turned ugly. And I saw myself in him, the version of me before training, before loss, before learning that fear does not disappear, it just gets managed. And I told him the truth. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to protect what matters anyway. And later, when my daughter asked me why the police officer knew my name, I told her a softer version of my story, not about missions or violence, but about helping people when things were hard, and she nodded as if it made perfect sense, because children understand honor better than adults do. And that night as I tucked her into bed, she asked if the man was going to be okay, and I realized then that the greatest thing I had ever protected was not a country or a teammate, but her heart, still gentle in a world that often rewards cruelty. And as I sat alone in the dark living room afterward, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic outside, I understood that legends are not forged in moments of domination. They are forged in restraint, in choosing calm when chaos invites you to become something you promised yourself you never would again. And although the cafe incident would spread online and strangers would debate who I was and what I did, none of that mattered compared to the quiet truth settling in my bones that my real mission had never ended. It had simply changed shape in every day. I chose patience, dignity, and protection over pride. I was still serving, just in a way that did not require a uniform or applause. The consequences arrived days later, not with shouting or fists, but with a knock on my door just after sunset. And when I opened it, I saw two men in plain clothes, standing with the kind of posture you never forget once you've worn a uniform yourself. Respectful but alert, eyes scanning without seeming to, and they explained calmly that the cafe incident had gone viral overnight. Millions of views, slowed down clips, armchair experts analyzing every movement, some praising restraint, others demanding explanations. And while I had hoped the moment would fade, the past has a way of resurfacing when the world decides it wants a story, because someone had identified me, not just as a former soldier, but as a Delta Force operator whose name still carried weight in rooms I had not entered for years. And the men told me that a few people were asking questions for the wrong reasons. Not fans or journalists, but individuals who saw opportunity in stirring old ghosts. And hearing that made my stomach drop in a way the slap never did, because I could handle an insult, even a threat to myself. But my daughter's safety was the line I would never allow crossed. And that night I lay awake, replaying the cafe over and over, wondering if silence would have been easier, if shrinking had been safer, until I realized the truth that training had carved into me long ago, that danger does not come from being seen, it comes from being unprepared. And so, the next morning I made a choice, not to run and not to hide, but to stand openly in who I was, without becoming who I had been, agreeing to a brief, controlled statement that focused not on my past, but on the lesson, that bullying thrives on fear and collapses under calm. And when the attention finally began to die down, something unexpected happened. Messages from single parents, from veterans, from people who had frozen once and wished they had not, thanking me not for force, but for control. And as I read those words with my daughter curled beside me on the couch, I understood that the cafe slap had done more than expose a bully. It had reminded people that strength can be quiet, that protection does not always look dramatic, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a legend can do is show the world that even with every skill to destroy, choosing peace is the greatest victory of all. The story settled back into something that looked like normal but felt different, because once the truth of who you are is spoken aloud, you can never fully return to pretending, and yet that was not a burden, it was a release. And months later, on an ordinary morning, as I walked my daughter to school, her small hand wrapped around mine, she looked up and said she was not scared anymore when people were loud or mean, because she knew her father would always stay calm and protect what mattered. And that single sentence meant more to me than any medal or mission briefing ever had, because it proved that the life I built after war was not smaller, it was deeper. And when we passed the cafe again weeks later, sunlight pouring through the same window where everything had begun, she squeezed my hand and smiled, not because of what happened there, but because it no longer held power over us. And as we kept walking, I realized that being a legend was never about what I could do to someone else. It was about what I could endure without losing myself. And that day I understood that my greatest service was not in uniform or silence or violence, but in raising a child who would grow up knowing that strength does not shout, dignity does not need witnesses, and real power is proven when you walk away with your head high and your humanity intact.